Her hands were shaking. Ottilie pressed her back against the cold stone pillar, heart hammering so loud she was certain someone would hear it. The grand hall of Whitmore Palace stretched before her, drowning in candlelight and silk and the quiet rustle of 100 noble guests holding their breath. The royal betrothal ceremony had begun. She was not supposed to be here. She was not supposed to be anywhere near this hall, this palace, or this world. She was a merchant's daughter, with ink-stained fingers and worn-out slippers, and the only reason she had slipped past the iron gates was because old Lord Carwick's steward had mistaken her for a seamstress carrying last-minute alterations. She had not corrected him. She had simply walked in, heart in her throat, and kept walking until she found this pillar. And now she could not move, because there, standing at the far end of the hall in full ceremonial dress, surrounded by generals and lords and men whose names filled history books, was Duke Alaric Devereux, the most feared, most admired, most untouchable man in all of England. His jaw was set like carved stone. His eyes were cold and forward-facing. He looked like a man carved out of duty and stripped of everything soft. Ottilie had told herself she only came to see it once, just to know what it looked like when a man like him chose someone else. She gripped the pillar tighter. The officiant raised his voice. The room stilled completely. And then, in that enormous silence, Duke Alaric's eyes moved, slowly, deliberately, across the length of the entire hall, past the ministers, past the gathered nobility, past his own bride-to-be standing in front of him. But when they stopped, directly on her, Ottilie stopped breathing. He did not look away. He did not blink. And then, in front of every lord, every lady, every person whose opinion could ruin a life or build a legacy, Duke Alaric raised one hand and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of that gilded hall, "Stop the ceremony." The room erupted, and Ottilie's world cracked open. Now, before we go further, tell me something. If you were standing in that hall when the Duke said those words, what would you have done? Would you have run or stayed? Drop your answer in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. It helps more than you know. And if this story already has your heart, please hit the subscribe button. We are just getting started. The morning Ottilie Vane Marsh decided to sneak into Whitmore Palace, she told herself it was just curiosity. Nothing more. Just one look. Just one last memory to fold up quietly and tuck away somewhere deep, where it would not hurt so much. She had been lying to herself for years. One more lie would not break anything. The city of Ashenvale was already dressed for celebration. Flower garlands hung from every lamppost. Street vendors sold little paper crests stamped with the Devereux family seal. Children ran through the cobblestones waving pennants, laughing at something they were too young to understand. To them, it was a festival. To Ottilie, it was a funeral. Duke Alaric Devereux was going to be formally betrothed today. By nightfall, his name would be bound to another woman in front of the entire kingdom. By morning, it would be in every newspaper, every drawing-room conversation, or every whispered exchange between ladies who had spent years dreaming about him. Ottilie had spent years doing something far more foolish than dreaming. She had spent years knowing him. Not the way the newspapers knew him. Not the cold, constructed version the palace presented to the public, that broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed duke who never smiled in portraits and never gave interviews and never once appeared at a social gathering without looking like he would rather be anywhere else. She knew the other version, the quieter one, the one who used to sit at the back of her father's bookshop on Teller's Lane every Thursday afternoon, turning pages with careful hands, sometimes reading aloud without realizing he was doing it. That version of Alaric Devereux had laughed once, softly, but at a joke she made about a poorly written villain in a Gothic novel. He had looked up from the page with something warm flickering in his eyes, and for exactly 3 seconds he had looked like an ordinary man. She had never forgotten those 3 seconds. That was the problem. She pulled her shawl tighter and joined the edge of a group of seamstresses being waved through the palace service entrance. Nobody questioned her. She kept her eyes low and her steps steady, and she told herself that if anyone stopped her, she would simply turn around and go home. She would walk back to Teller's Lane and open the shop and spend the rest of the day reshelving books and pretending her chest did not feel like something was being slowly pressed against it. Nobody stopped her. She moved through narrow service corridors lined with hurrying footmen and harried attendants carrying trays and flower arrangements and folded programs. The smell of beeswax candles mixed with hothouse roses and expensive perfume. Everything felt too bright, too polished, too perfect. It was the kind of perfection that reminded ordinary people how far they were from belonging. Ottilie had never felt that distance more sharply than she did right now. She found the pillar by accident. She had been trying to locate a side exit when she turned a corner, and suddenly the corridor opened up into the upper gallery of the grand ceremony hall, and the view hit her like a physical force. The room below was enormous. Pale marble floors reflected the light of 1,000 candles arranged along gilded fixtures that ran the length of the ceiling. Rows of chairs held the most powerful men and women in the kingdom. At the far end of the hall, on a raised platform draped in deep ceremonial fabric, stood the officiant in his formal robes. And there was Alaric. She had not seen him in 8 months. 8 months since last Thursday he came to the bookshop. 8 months later, he stood at the counter with a leather-bound copy of something he had already read twice before, and she had asked him why he kept buying books he had already finished, and he had looked at her for a long moment before saying, quietly, that some things were worth returning to. He had not come back after that. She understood why now. He looked different in ceremonial dress. The same height, the same broad shoulders, the same dark hair cut close and neat. But everything about his posture was harder, or he stood like a man who had been told exactly where to place his feet and had obeyed without question. His hands were clasped behind his back. His jaw was set. His eyes were fixed on some middle point in the air in front of him. He looked like a soldier on the last day of a war he had already lost. Ottilie pressed herself behind the pillar and told herself to leave. She had seen him. She had gotten the one look she promised herself. It was enough. It had to be enough. She did not leave. The ceremony began with a procession of minor officials reading formal declarations. She could not follow all the language, dense with legal terminology and historical precedent. But she understood the shape of it. This was the moment that would seal everything, the moment that made it permanent and official and completely, thoroughly, irreversibly real. That the woman who would become the Duke's betrothed entered from the opposite side of the hall, accompanied by her family and 2 representatives of the crown. Lady Drusilla Fenmore was exactly what Ottilie had imagined from the newspaper descriptions. Tall, poised, impeccably presented. She moved with the kind of confidence that came not from arrogance, but from a lifetime of being told she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She probably was. Her family had served the crown for 4 generations. The match made every kind of sense that mattered in this world. Ottilie felt something go very still inside her chest. The officiant raised his voice to begin the formal binding words. The entire hall went quiet. That particular quality of silence that only exists when hundreds of people all hold their breath at the same moment. Ottilie gripped the stone pillar with both hands and stared down at the man she had spent 3 years convincing herself she did not love. And then Alaric's eyes moved. It was not a dramatic sweep of the room. It was slow, almost involuntary, like a compass needle pulled by something it could not explain. His gaze travelled sideways, past the officiant, past the front rows of seated guests, past everything that was supposed to hold his attention. It travelled upward, toward the gallery. And it found her. The shock of it knocked the breath from her body. She was half hidden behind the pillar. She was dressed in plain clothes. She was nobody in that room, a ghost who had wandered in from the wrong story. There was no reason his eyes should have found her, no reason at all. But they did, and they stayed. 5 seconds passed, then 10, as Alaric Devereux stood at his own betrothal ceremony in front of the highest-ranking members of the kingdom, and he did not look away from the merchant's daughter, hiding behind a pillar in the upper gallery. Ottilie's hands went cold. His expression didn't change, not visibly, but something shifted behind his eyes, something that moved too fast for her to name, something that looked almost like the way a man looks when he has been holding his breath for a very long time and has suddenly remembered what it feels like to breathe. The officiant continued speaking. Alaric raised his hand. "Stop the ceremony." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. The quality of his voice in that hall, deep and absolutely certain, made every other sound in the room disappear. For 1 full second, nothing moved. Then everything moved at once. The officiant stopped mid-word and stared. Lady Drusilla turned, her expression carefully controlled, but her eyes wide. The assembled guests erupted in a low, urgent wave of sound, whispers crashing into each other like water. 2 of the Crown's representatives rose from their seats. Lord Fenmore, Drusilla's father, stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the marble floor. Alaric had not moved his eyes from the gallery. Ottilie could not move at all. She was still gripping the pillar. Her vision had gone slightly strange at the edges, the way it does when your body understands something terrible is happening before your mind catches up. Every instinct she had was screaming at her to run, to slip back into the corridor, to disappear the way she had appeared, quietly and without a trace. Her feet refused to cooperate, but one of the Crown's representatives stepped forward and spoke to Alaric in a low, urgent voice. Alaric answered without turning his head. The representative stepped back, visibly shaken. Lord Fenmore was now speaking loudly enough that his voice carried upward, something sharp and outraged. But Ottilie could not make out the specific words over the sound of her own heartbeat. Lady Drusilla was still standing in her place. She had not moved. She was looking at Alaric with an expression that was very, very difficult to read. Not hurt, exactly. Not angry. Something more complicated than both. Something that looked, strangely, almost like recognition. Then Alaric finally turned his head. He spoke to one of his own men, a tall officer stationed near the platform. The officer nodded once, sharply, and began moving toward the far side of the hall, toward the staircase that led up to the gallery. Coming toward Ottilie. That was when her feet started working again. She spun away from the pillar and moved fast, back into the corridor, her slippers nearly silent on the stone floor. Behind her she could still hear the hall, the rising voices, the controlled chaos of a ceremony that had just shattered in front of the entire kingdom. She did not look back. She turned left, then right, following the same path she had come in through, trying to remember which corridor led back to the service entrance and the street beyond it. She took a wrong turn. The corridor she found herself in was different, quieter. The walls here were panelled in dark wood instead of painted plaster. There were no hurrying footmen here, no trays, no flowers. Just a long, empty hallway with tall windows on one side, throwing rectangles of afternoon light across a polished floor. She had wandered into the private wing. She turned to go back, and that was when she heard the footsteps. Not the officers. These were different. Faster. Coming from somewhere ahead of her, around the curve of the corridor, she pressed herself against the wall between two windows, pulling her shawl up around her face, and waited for whoever it was to pass. The footsteps didn't pass. They stopped, directly in front of her. Ottilie lowered her shawl. Alaric Devereux stood 4 feet away from her, still in his full ceremonial dress, his chest rising and falling with the effort of someone who had moved very quickly through a very large building. His expression was exactly what she remembered from the gallery, of that thing behind his eyes that she could not name. Neither of them spoke. Outside the tall windows, the city of Ashenvale was still celebrating. Someone on the street below was playing a brass instrument. The sound floated up, bright and completely absurd, given what was happening in this corridor. Alaric spoke first. "You came," he said. Not an accusation, not a question, just a fact, stated in a voice that was much quieter than the one that had stopped the ceremony. Ottilie's mouth was very dry. "I was leaving," she said. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Something older and more tired than a smile. "You were always leaving," he said. "Every Thursday. You would say the shop was closing, even when it wasn't." She stared at him. "You knew?" "I knew," he said, or the brass instrument on the street below played a cheerful little phrase, completely unaware that somewhere above it, in a private corridor of Whitmore Palace, 2 people were standing in the wreckage of something that had never been allowed to begin. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything that had never been said, pressing against the walls of that corridor like water against glass. Ottilie could hear her own breathing. She could hear the distant, muffled uproar still rolling through the ceremony hall somewhere behind them. She could hear, faintly, the sound of quick footsteps belonging to people who were probably looking for both of them right now. Alaric did not seem to hear any of it. He was looking at her the way he used to look at certain pages in certain books, like he had found the sentence he had been searching for, and was afraid that if he looked away, it would rearrange itself into something else. "You stopped the ceremony," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Yes." "In front of everyone?" "Yes." "Alaric." She pressed her back against the wall, needing the solidity of it. "Do you understand what you have just done?" "Perfectly," he said. That single word landed in her chest, like a stone dropped into still water. He meant it. That was the terrifying part. There was no confusion in his face, no panic, no sign that he was only now beginning to understand the weight of what he had done. He had understood it before he did it. He had done it anyway. She felt something crack open in her, something she had spent a long time sealing shut. "You cannot," she said. "Alaric, or you cannot do this. Not for me. I am nobody here. I am a merchant's daughter who snuck into your ceremony and hid behind a pillar. This is not a story that ends the way you are looking at me like it will." "You always did that," he said. She blinked. "Did what?" "Told me what was possible before I had the chance to say what I wanted." He took 1 step toward her. Just one. And stopped. "You used to do it with the books, too. I would reach for something and you would say, 'Oh, that one is heavy going. It might not be what you are looking for,' before you even let me open it." She remembered. She also remembered that he had always opened the books anyway. "This is not a book," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is considerably more complicated." From somewhere in the palace, a door slammed. Then voices, multiple voices, for the kind that belonged to men who held official positions and were not pleased. Alaric turned his head slightly toward the sound, then turned back to her, with no visible change in his decision. "You need to hear something from me," he said, "and I need you to stand still long enough to hear it. Can you do that?" Ottilie wanted to say no. Every sensible part of her was already calculating exits, measuring the distance back to the service corridor, composing the careful story she would tell herself later about why none of this had happened. But she was still standing against the wall. Her feet had betrayed her again. "Say it quickly," she said. He did not say it quickly. He looked at her for a moment first, like a man organizing something heavy, making sure he could carry it without dropping it. "The Thursdays," he began. "I didn't come for the books." She had known that. She had not known that she had known it until this moment, and the knowing of it hit her differently now, here, in this corridor, with the ceremony hall still echoing somewhere behind him. "The first time was an accident," he continued. "My carriage had a broken wheel on Teller's Lane, and your shop was the only dry place to wait. You were arguing with a delivery man about a water-damaged crate. You were completely right and completely furious, and you did not notice me come in for 20 minutes. Something changed in his voice, softer. "When you finally did notice, you did not treat me like a duke." "I did not know who you were," she said. "I know," he said. "That was the second reason I came back." The voices were getting closer. Ottilie heard her name. No, not her name. Or nobody here knew her name. Just raised voices demanding to know where the Duke had gone. Someone was coming down this corridor. She could hear the footsteps. 2 sets, maybe 3, coming from the direction of the main hall. Alaric heard them too. His jaw tightened slightly. "There is a room at the end of this corridor," he said, low and fast. "Second door on the left. Go inside and stay there. Do not open the door unless you hear me knock 3 times. She stared at him. "You want me to hide?" "For now," he said. "Yes." "This is—" she started, and stopped. There was no word large enough for what this was. "I know," he said. "Go." She went. The room was a small sitting room, clearly used for private meetings rather than habitation. A writing desk, several chairs, a cold fireplace. The kind of room where difficult things were decided and then never spoken of again. Ottilie shut the door behind her and stood in the middle of it with her hands pressed flat against her thighs, listening. She heard Alaric's voice in the corridor, calm and authoritative, something she could not fully make out. She heard another voice, older, clipped with barely restrained outrage. Then a third voice, formal and careful, the kind that belonged to someone whose job required them to stay controlled no matter what was happening around them. Then silence, then footsteps moving away. Then nothing. She waited. The cold fireplace offered no comfort. The writing desk had a leather-bound ledger on it, closed, with no name on the cover. Ottilie looked at the chairs and did not sit, or sitting felt like accepting that this was a situation she was staying in. She was not staying in this situation. She was going to walk out of this room, out of this palace, back to Teller's Lane, and she was going to spend the rest of the week pretending this day had not happened. She was still standing in the middle of the room when the 3 knocks came. She opened the door. Alaric was alone now. Whatever he had said to the men in the corridor had worked, at least temporarily, but the expression on his face had shifted. There was something in it now that had not been there before. A tightness around his eyes. Not fear. Something adjacent to it. The look of a man who is calculating costs and has arrived at a number that is very large. "Lady Drusilla has left the hall," he said. "Or her father is demanding a private meeting with the Crown's representatives within the hour. The ceremony is formally suspended." Ottilie felt the blood drain from her face. Suspended. Not cancelled. Suspended. He entered the room and pushed the door closed behind him. "There is a difference that matters. Alaric," her voice came out very small, "what have you done?" He sat down in one of the chairs, which surprised her. He looked, for the first time since she had seen him in the gallery, like a man who needed to sit. He rested his forearms on his knees and looked at the cold fireplace. "The Fenmore match was arranged 14 months ago," he said. "I agreed to it because I was told it was necessary, because the Crown needed an alliance with the Fenmore family holdings in the Northern Territories, because I have spent my entire life doing what was necessary." He paused. "I have never once done what I wanted." The room felt very quiet. "I did not know," Ottilie said softly, "that you wanted anything." He looked up at her. "I know you did not know. I was very careful to make sure of that." Something about that landed differently than she expected. Not warm. Something more painful than warm. The realization that the careful distance she had always felt between them had been built deliberately, from his side, with intention. "Why?" she asked. If there was something, why did you maintain that distance for 3 years and then stop your own betrothal ceremony in front of the entire kingdom? Why not one or the other? Why that extreme? He was quiet for a moment. "Because for 3 years I told myself it was impossible. I told myself you were right, that it was not a story that could end the way I wanted it to. I made my peace with that. I agreed to the Fenmore match, and I told myself that was the correct, responsible, appropriate thing to do." He looked at the fireplace again. "And then I was standing in that hall today, and someone was about to speak the words that would make it permanent, and I looked up and saw you behind that pillar." She could not breathe properly. "You looked," he said, "exactly the way you looked the first time you realized I had been coming to the shop on purpose. Like you were trying very hard not to feel something you were already feeling." Ottilie sat down. Her legs had given up pretending they were going to carry her anywhere. "You cannot walk away from the Fenmore alliance," she said. "You know that. Or the Northern Territories, the Crown's approval, your family's position, all of it depends on—" "I know what depends on it," he said. "I am not asking you to pretend the consequences do not exist. I am asking you to let me think through them with someone who will not simply tell me what I should do." She looked at him. This man who had stopped a royal ceremony, who had left the most powerful room in England to chase a girl through the private corridors of the palace because she had tried to run, who was now sitting across from her in a cold room asking her to help him think. He had always done that in the bookshop, brought problems he could not voice directly, hidden inside the themes of novels, waiting for her to find them. She had always found them. "Tell me the full shape of it," she said. "All of it, or not the version you would tell the Crown's representative. The real one." He looked at her with that expression again, the one she still could not fully name. It was somewhere between relief and grief, which should not have been possible, but there it was. "The Northern Territories matter," he began, "but the specific clause in the alliance agreement is not actually tied to a marriage. It is tied to a formal military partnership between the Devereux estate and the Fenmore holdings. The marriage was the mechanism the two families preferred, but it is not the only mechanism that satisfies the Crown's requirement." Ottilie went very still. "Does Lord Fenmore know that?" "Lord Fenmore does not want to know it," Alaric said. "His preference is marriage, because it gives his family a permanent tie to the Devereux name. He constructed the negotiation carefully to make the marriage feel like the only option." "But it is not," she said slowly. "No," he said. "It is not." She looked at him. He looked back at her. Outside the palace, somewhere in the streets of Ashenvale, the city was still celebrating a betrothal that had already fractured at its centre. Paper crests with the Devereux seal were still being sold by vendors who did not know yet that everything had stopped. "You knew this before today," Ottilie said. You knew there was another mechanism. Yes, he said. Then why did you agree to the marriage? He was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that is not evasion, but weight. Like someone picking up something very old and heavy and deciding whether to hand it to another person or set it down alone. Because, he finally said, the alternative mechanism requires the Duke of Devereux to formally name a different alliance partner, and the only person I have ever wanted to name, his voice dropped very low, sells books on Teller's Lane. The brass instrument on the street had stopped playing. In its absence, the room was completely silent. Ottilie sat across from the Duke of Devereux in a cold sitting room in the palace he had just thrown into chaos, and she understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, that this moment was not the beginning of something. It was the surface of something that had been building for 3 years under both their feet, without either of them admitting the ground was moving. You should have told me, she said. Would you have believed me? He asked. She opened her mouth, closed it. No, she would not have. Or she would have said exactly what she had said in the corridor, that she was nobody here, that it was not a story that ended that way. She would have been very logical, and very sensible, and very wrong. No, she admitted. He nodded. Like that answer confirmed something he had already decided. I know, he said. So I waited. And I was too careful for too long. And then today happened. A sharp knock came at the door. Not 3 knocks. One, hard and official. Both of them looked at the door. Your Grace. The voice outside was controlled, but had steel running through it. The Crown's first representative is requesting your immediate presence. This is not optional. Alaric stood. He straightened his ceremonial jacket with the automatic, practiced motion of someone who had been doing it since childhood, but for a moment he looked exactly like what he was. A duke. A man whose every breath had political consequence. A man whose life had very little room in it for what he actually wanted. Then he looked at Ottilie. Stay in this room, he said. Please. I am not very good at staying, she said. I know, he said. Stay anyway. He opened the door and walked out, and the door clicked shut behind him, and Ottilie sat alone in the cold room, with the unlit fireplace, and the closed ledger on the desk, and the full, enormous, impossible weight of what was happening pressing down on her from every direction. She sat very still, and she stayed. She counted the minutes by the sounds. First came the heavy footsteps of officials moving through the corridor outside. 3 sets, maybe 4, all purposeful and sharp. Then came a longer stretch of quiet that was not really quiet at all, but filled with the low, indistinct murmur of voices from somewhere deeper in the palace. Then a door, somewhere far away, opened and closed, with enough force to suggest that whoever had closed it wasn't pleased. Ottilie sat in the chair Alaric had used, and tried to think clearly. It was not working. She kept returning to the same image. Alaric stood in that hall, in full ceremonial dress, surrounded by the weight of the kingdom, raising his hand and saying those words with the certainty of someone who had already counted the cost and paid it before anyone else even knew a bill had arrived. She had spent 3 years constructing a careful version of their relationship in her mind. Polite, bounded. The Duke who liked books, and the shopkeeper who sold them. Nothing dangerous. Nothing that could not be walked away from cleanly. She had been so committed to that version that she had missed what was actually happening. Or rather, she had seen it and refused to name it, which was worse. He had not missed anything. He had seen all of it, and carried it quietly for 3 years and said nothing, because he had known, correctly, that she would have retreated the moment he spoke. She pressed her hands together in her lap and stared at the cold fireplace. The door opened. Not Alaric. A young woman came in fast, closing the door behind her with practiced quiet. She was perhaps 19, dressed in the practical dark clothing of a palace attendant. But her posture was too direct, and her eyes were too sharp for someone whose job was simply to carry things. She looked at Ottilie with an expression that was assessing rather than surprising. "You are the one from the gallery," the young woman said. It was not a question. Ottilie kept her face calm. "Who are you?" "My name is Petra Solve," the young woman said, moving to the window and checking the courtyard below with a quick glance before turning back. "I am the Duke's personal secretary. I have been his secretary for 4 years, which means I know things about his schedule, his correspondence, and his decisions that very few people in this palace know." She paused. "Including the fact that he has turned down 3 separate betrothal negotiations over the past 2 years, all of which were politically suitable, and none of which he gave a proper reason for refusing." Ottilie said nothing. Petra sat in the other chair, completely uninvited, with the ease of someone who was used to making herself at home in inconvenient situations. "I also know that every Thursday for nearly 3 years, the Duke rerouted his afternoon schedule to allow for an unrecorded stop on Teller's Lane. He recorded it in his personal log as private correspondence. He does not have any private correspondence on Teller's Lane." The room felt slightly smaller than it had a moment ago. "Why are you telling me this?" Ottilie asked carefully. "Because you look like you are about to talk yourself out of this," Petra said, with the directness of someone who did not believe in spending words on politeness when efficiency was available. "And I have watched the Duke talk himself into the Fenmore arrangement for 14 months because he had decided you would not stay. If you leave today, he will accept that as confirmation that he was right, and he will go back to the hall and complete the ceremony, and that will be the end of it." Ottilie felt something cold move through her. "He told you about me." "He told me nothing," Petra said. "I am observant. It is my job." She stood up and moved back toward the door. "I am also telling you that Lord Fenmore has brought 2 additional legal representatives into the private meeting with the Crown. He is attempting to have the suspension reversed by arguing procedural grounds. He has approximately 40 minutes before the Crown's first representative loses patience with him." "And Alaric?" Ottilie asked. "The Duke," Petra said, and there was something precise about the way she used the title. Not cold, just accurate. Boss is currently managing 3 simultaneous conversations with people who all want different things from him. He is doing it well because he always does. But he will need an answer from you before those 40 minutes are gone." Ottilie stared at her. "An answer to what? He has not asked me anything." Petra looked at her with the expression of someone who has watched intelligent people miss obvious things and has learned not to be surprised by it. "He asked you to stay," she said. "For a man like him, that is everything." She left. Ottilie sat with that for a long time. Outside the window, the afternoon light had shifted. The celebration in the streets below had quieted somewhat, perhaps because word was beginning to travel that something had gone wrong at the palace, or perhaps simply because the early afternoon energy had worn itself out. Or the paper crests and pennants were still there, hanging in the still air, cheerful and oblivious. She thought about Teller's Lane, about the shop, with its narrow shelves and the particular smell of old paper and linseed oil, and the candle she kept burning on the counter in winter because the drafts came in under the door. She thought about her father, who was probably in the back room right now, cataloguing a new delivery and wondering where she had gone off to. She thought about the life she had, small and known and entirely hers. Then she thought about Alaric in that hall, his hand raised, his voice carried to every corner of the room. 2 words that had cracked the entire ceremony open like a stone through glass. stop the ceremony, for her, and because she was behind a pillar in the gallery, and he had seen her, and something in him had decided, in the space of a breath, that 3 years of careful silence was enough. She stood up. She did not leave through the main door. Petra had left it slightly unlatched, and through the gap Ottilie could hear voices still moving through the corridor, official and purposeful. She moved to the window instead. The courtyard below was 2 stories down, but there was a narrow ledge, and below that a section of lower roof connected to a garden wall. She had climbed worse as a child. Her father's bookshop had a rear wall that backed onto the canal, and she had navigated that particular route so many times as a girl that her hands still remembered the handholds. She was not running. She needed to be clear about that with herself. She was not leaving. She was moving, which was different. She needed to reach the private meeting room before those 40 minutes were gone, and she was not going to get there through a corridor full of Crown officials who would stop her before she took 3 steps. So she went through the window. The ledge was narrow but solid. The lower roof section held her weight. The garden wall was old stone with plenty of grip. She dropped into the formal garden below without any injury worse than a scuffed palm, straightened her shawl, and looked at the rear entrance of the palace's private wing. There was a footman at the door. Young, alert, clearly not expecting a woman to come over the garden wall. Ottilie walked toward him, with the absolute confidence of someone who was supposed to be exactly where they were. "I have an urgent message for the Duke's secretary," she said, before he could speak. "Miss Solve is expecting me. If you delay me, she will want to know why." The footman hesitated for exactly long enough to make a mistake. He opened the door. She was inside. The private wing was quieter than the main palace, but not empty. She moved through it quickly, following the sound of voices, the low, urgent kind that meant important men were running out of patience. She turned a corner and found herself at the end of a wide hallway with several closed doors. One of them had 2 Crown guards stationed outside it, standing at the particular kind of attention that meant the conversation inside was extremely significant. That was the room. She could not go through the guards. She turned and found a narrow door set into the paneling, the kind used by servants, slightly ajar. She slipped through it and found herself in a thin passage that ran parallel to the main hallway. She followed it until the voices grew louder, and she found the place where a section of the passage wall met the back of the meeting room, close enough that she could hear almost clearly. Lord Fenmore's voice was the loudest. He was not shouting, but he had the particular forceful quality of a man who was accustomed to getting his way through sheer certainty. The Devereux family had made a formal commitment. His daughter had been publicly placed in a position of humiliation. This suspension was unlawful, and the Duke's behaviour was an affront to the Crown alliance that had been agreed upon in good faith. The Crown's first representative answered in a much quieter, more measured voice. As suspensions of ceremony were within ducal authority under Charter, the matter would be reviewed. Lord Fenmore should allow the process to proceed. Then Alaric's voice. Steady, not raised, absolutely unmovable. He was not arguing with Fenmore. He was not defending himself. He was doing something more difficult. He was redirecting. Every time Fenmore pushed toward the marriage, Alaric turned the conversation back to the military partnership clause, the actual Crown requirement, the mechanism that existed separately from the betrothal. He was winning. Slowly, carefully, with great precision, he was dismantling the Fenmore argument from the inside. But Fenmore was not finished. "You will tell me," Fenmore said, his voice dropping to something quieter and more dangerous than the outrage had been, "exactly why you stopped that ceremony. And you will tell me who the woman in the gallery was, because I had eyes in that room, Your Grace, and I saw where you were looking when you raised your hand." A pause. "She is no one you know," Alaric said. "That is not an answer," Fenmore said. "It is the only one I am giving you," Alaric said. "What happens next, between this family and the Devereux estate, will be decided on the terms of the Crown Charter, Lord Fenmore. Not on personal grounds. I suggest you instruct your legal representatives accordingly." The Crown's representative made a sound that might have been approved. Ottilie stood in the narrow passage with her back against the wall, and her hand pressed over her mouth, and her eyes burning in a way that had nothing to do with dust. He had not named her. He had protected her, in a room full of powerful men who could have made her life very difficult, by simply refusing to name her. And he had done it while simultaneously, methodically, carefully dismantling the trap that had been built around him. She thought about what Petra had said, that for a man like him, asking her to stay was everything. She thought about 3 years of Thursdays. She thought about a man who had come back, again and again, to a small bookshop on Teller's Lane, not for the books. She pushed herself off the wall and went to find a way back into the corridor. She was going to be there when he came out of that room. She found a position near the end of the hallway, just past the guard's sight line, but close enough that she would see the meeting room door when it opened. She waited with her back straight and her hands folded in front of her, as in the posture of someone who was supposed to be there. 2 other palace staff passed her without a second glance. She had been waiting perhaps 20 minutes when the meeting room door opened, and the Crown's first representative emerged with 2 assistants. He looked like a man who had just resolved something complex, and was now moving on to the next complex thing. Lord Fenmore came out behind him, followed by his legal representatives. Fenmore's face was controlled, but the control was costing him something. His jaw was tight, his eyes were flat with the particular quality of a man who has lost a round and is already planning the next one. He saw Ottilie. She saw the moment he recognized her, not by name, not specifically, but as the woman from the gallery. His eyes stopped on her face and sharpened, and for a moment the 2 of them looked at each other across the width of the hallway. Then Alaric came through the door. He saw Fenmore looking at her at the same moment. He saw her. Something moved fast and decisively through his expression. He stepped between them, not aggressively but absolutely, placing himself in the physical space between Ottilie and Fenmore with the smooth certainty of someone who had assessed the situation in a single second and acted. "Lord Fenmore," he said, addressing the older man without turning his back on the hallway. "The Crown's representative will have the revised partnership terms to you by Thursday. I trust you will find them satisfactory." Fenmore's gaze moved from Ottilie to Alaric, a long, cold assessment. Then he nodded once, stiffly, and turned and walked away with his party following behind him. Alaric turned to Ottilie. "You went through the window," he said. "The corridor was full of officials," she said. "I told you to stay in the room." "I stayed long enough," she said. "And then I needed to be here." He looked at her. His ceremonial jacket was still impeccable. His posture was still ducal, but his eyes were the same as they had been in the corridor earlier, open in a way she was not used to seeing on this particular face. "Did you hear the meeting?" he asked. "Enough of it," she said. He nodded slowly. "Then you know that the Fenmore situation is not fully resolved. He will push again, through other channels. He is not the kind of man who accepts a single setback." "I know," she said. "And you understand that what I am proposing, what today has started, will not be simple or quiet or without consequence. I understood that before I climbed out the window," she said. Something shifted in his face. That thing she had never been able to name. She was closer to naming it now. It was the look of a man who had expected the worst for so long that being given something else felt genuinely disorienting. "Ottilie," he said. Her name in his voice was different than she had ever heard it. At the bookshop he had always used it carefully, with the slight formality of a customer addressing a proprietor. Now it sounded like something he had been holding in his hands for a long time, and was only just allowing himself to open. "I know what I am asking you to step into," he said. "I will not pretend otherwise. There are people in this palace and in this city who will scrutinize everything about you, what your family, your position. There will be people who say things that are designed to make you feel that you do not belong. People have said things like that my whole life," Ottilie said quietly. "I am still here." He was quiet for a moment. "I know. That is one of the things I have always—" He stopped, started again. "I have a great deal to say to you that I should have said considerably earlier, but not in a palace hallway." "No," she agreed. "Not here." Petra appeared at the far end of the hallway, moving toward them with a folder of documents and the brisk walk of someone managing 17 things simultaneously. She stopped beside Alaric and handed him 2 letters and a folded card. "The Crown's representative has confirmed the meeting for tomorrow morning. Lady Drusilla's party has left the palace grounds. Oh, and your aunt has arrived." Alaric went very still, Ottilie noticed. "Your aunt?" she asked. "The Dowager Duchess Renata Devereux," Petra said, with the precise neutrality of someone who had strong feelings they were professionally required to suppress. "She arrived approximately 15 minutes ago. She is currently in the south drawing room, requesting tea and an explanation, in that order." Alaric closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, then opened them. "Tell her I will be there shortly." Petra looked at Ottilie, then back at Alaric, with an expression that managed to convey that she had opinions about this situation without actually expressing them. She nodded and walked away. "Your aunt," Ottilie said again. "She is," Alaric said carefully, "a person of strong views." "Does she know what happened today?" "She knows," he said, "or she was on her way to the city already for the ceremony. She will have heard within minutes of it happening." He paused. "She will want to meet you." Ottilie felt something in her stomach shift. "Today. If I bring you to the south drawing room, yes. If I do not, she will find another way, and that will be more difficult for everyone." He looked at her with an expression that was almost apologetic. "She is not unkind. She is direct, and she holds strong opinions, and she will ask you things that are none of her business. But she is not cruel." "Wonderful," Ottilie said. He almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but it was the closest thing to one she had seen on his face in 8 months, and it landed somewhere behind her ribs and stayed there. "You do not have to," he said. "I can take you out through the east gate right now and see you safely back to Teller's Lane. No one would stop you. Today would still have happened, and we would still need to speak properly, but you would not have to walk into a drawing room and sit across from my aunt on the same afternoon you climbed out of a palace window." Ottilie thought about that for a moment. "What is she like?" she asked. "Actually?" Not the diplomatic version. He considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved. She decided at the age of 34 that she was finished pretending to enjoy things she didn't enjoy, and she has held to that principle for 20 years. She is occasionally exhausting and usually right. "I think I understand her," Ottilie said. "Or she will think she understands you before you have finished your first sentence," he said. "She is usually right about that, too." Ottilie straightened her shawl. Her slippers were still worn. Her hair had not been arranged for a palace visit. She had ink on 2 of her fingers from the morning, which she had not thought about until this moment. She looked exactly like what she was, a merchant's daughter who had climbed a garden wall and listened at a private meeting and was now standing in a ducal corridor making decisions that would change her life. "Take me to the drawing room," she said. He did not look surprised. He looked, briefly, like the man from the bookshop, the one who opened the books anyway, even after she told him they were heavy going. They walked together through the private wing, not touching, with a careful few inches of space between them that felt both entirely proper and completely inadequate. Ottilie was aware of every footman who glanced at them, every door they passed, every small adjustment the palace would have to make to absorb the fact that the Duke was walking beside her. The south drawing-room was warm. Someone had built up the fire and arranged a tea service on the low table with the efficiency of staff who had learned that the Dowager Duchess Renata did not wait pleasantly for things she had requested. The Dowager Duchess herself was seated in the largest chair, with the posture of someone who had never in her life been told to sit up straight because she had simply always done it. She was perhaps 65, with silver hair arranged with strict elegance and eyes that were the same dark quality as Alaric's, but with decades more amusement in them. She was drinking her tea and looking at the fire, and when the door opened, she turned her head with the unhurried movement of someone who was expecting exactly what arrived. Her eyes went to Alaric first, a quick, total assessment, then to Ottilie, a longer one. "Sit down," she said, to both of them, equally. They sat. The Dowager poured a second cup of tea and set it in front of Ottilie without asking whether she wanted it. Then she folded her hands in her lap and looked at Ottilie with the focused attention of someone reading a document they intended to understand completely. "Your name," she said. "Ottilie Vanemarsh," Ottilie said. "My father is Bernard Vanemarsh, or he operates a bookshop on Teller's Lane in Ashenvale." "I know Teller's Lane," the Dowager said. "I know the shop. I have not been inside it, but I know the street. Your father inherited the property from his mother, I believe." Ottilie blinked. "Yes. I make it my business to know things," the Dowager said, without particular pride, simply as a fact. She looked at Alaric. "You stopped the ceremony." "Yes," he said. "Because of this young woman?" "Yes." The Dowager looked back at Ottilie. "And you? You were hiding in the gallery." "Behind a pillar," Ottilie said. "Yes." "Why?" Ottilie looked at the woman directly. She had the feeling that anything less than complete honesty would be identified immediately and held against her. "Because I wanted to see it once. I thought if I saw it, if it was real and finished in front of me, I could stop carrying something I had been carrying for a long time." The Dowager was quiet for a moment. "And instead my nephew stopped the ceremony and chased you through the palace." "He did not chase me," Ottilie said. "I ran. He simply knew where I would end up." Something moved in the Dowager's eyes. Not quite a smile, the close relative of one. "You are not what I expected," the Dowager said. "I do not know what you expected," Ottilie said. "Something softer," the Dowager said. "Something more apologetic for existing in an inconvenient place." She picked up her teacup. "I find I prefer what actually arrived." Alaric said nothing. He was watching his aunt with the careful attention of a man who understood that this conversation was not his to control. "There will be difficulty," the Dowager said, addressing Ottilie directly. "Do you understand that?" "The Duke explained," Ottilie said. "He will have explained the political difficulty," the Dowager said. "I am talking about the social kind. The kind that happens in rooms where Alaric is not present. The kind that is delivered with smiles by women who have very good manners and very poor intentions." Her eyes were steady. "That kind of difficulty is harder to defend against because it has no official form. You cannot argue with it the way you can argue with a charter clause." "No," Ottilie agreed. "You cannot. Can you withstand it?" Ottilie thought about the delivery man she had argued with that morning, over the water-damaged crate, before any of this had happened. No, she thought about the merchants who had tried to undercharge her father for stock because they assumed a bookshop run by a widower, and his daughter would not know the proper rates. She thought about every room she had ever walked into, where the first thing people calculated was how little she mattered. "I have been withstanding things my whole life," she said. "I simply did not always have a reason that felt worth it." The dowager set down her teacup. "Good," she said. "Drink your tea." The tea was still warm. Ottilie drank it and tried to feel ordinary, which was impossible, but the trying helped. The Dowager Duchess Renata had moved on from direct interrogation to a precise and detailed account of everything that was wrong with the Crown's current approach to Northern Territory alliances, or which was apparently a subject she had strong opinions about, and had been waiting for an appropriate audience to deliver them to. Alaric listened with the focused attention of someone receiving genuinely useful military intelligence. Ottilie listened because the Dowager was, against all reasonable expectation, interesting. She also listened because it gave her something to do with her mind, other than think about what came next. What came next was enormous. She could feel the shape of it pressing at the edges of the warm drawing room, waiting. The Fenmore situation was not resolved. The ceremony was suspended, not cancelled. The Crown's representatives would meet with Alaric tomorrow morning. Lord Fenmore would push through whatever channels he had available, and a man with his resources had many. At the city outside was still draped in celebration bunting for a betrothal that had broken apart at its centre. And she was a bookshop owner's daughter, sitting in a ducal drawing room drinking tea. The door opened without a knock. The man who entered was perhaps 50, broad through the shoulders, with the weathered look of someone who spent more time outdoors than in drawing rooms. He was dressed well, but without ceremony, and he moved into the room with the ease of someone who had been walking into Devereux spaces his whole life. His eyes went to the Dowager first, then to Alaric, then to Ottilie, where they stopped with sharp and immediate interest. "You started without me," he said to the room in general. "You were late," the Dowager said, without looking up. "I was managing the staff situation in the East Corridor." He looked at Alaric with pointed meaning, left in considerable disorder. "Lord Cassius Holt," Alaric said to Ottilie, with the resigned tone of a man performing an introduction he had not planned. "My mother's cousin. He manages the Devereux estate operations." "And everything else nobody else wants to manage," Cassius said cheerfully, dropping into a chair and pouring himself tea with the familiarity of a man in his own kitchen. He looked at Ottilie. "You are the one from the gallery." "Everyone keeps saying that," Ottilie said. He grinned. It was a broad, genuine grin that had nothing calculated in it. "I was watching from the second row when it happened. I saw exactly which direction Alaric was looking before he raised his hand." He glanced at his cousin. "I owe Petra 12 shillings. Alaric looked at the ceiling briefly. "You had a wager." "Petra had a wager. I was the other half of it." Cassius settled back comfortably. "She said that if you ever saw her in the wrong place at the wrong time, you would stop everything. I said you were too controlled for that. I was wrong. I am paying my debt cheerfully." "You are embarrassing yourself," the Dowager said mildly. "I am being honest," Cassius said. "Which is more than most people in this palace have managed today." He looked at Ottilie again, with less amusement and more genuine assessment. "How are you holding up? Because from the outside, today looks like a significant amount of the world rearranging itself very fast." Ottilie found, to her surprise, that she liked him. "I am managing," she said. "Good," he said. "You will need to keep managing, because I should tell you that there are currently 4 separate newspaper correspondents waiting outside the East Gate, and by tomorrow morning there will be more. Someone in the ceremony hall talked, which was inevitable. And now the story is moving. The room shifted. Alaric's expression tightened. The dowager set down her teacup. "How much do they know?" Alaric asked. "That you stopped the ceremony, that you were seen looking at the gallery before you did it, that Lady Drusilla left the palace." Cassius paused. "They do not have a name yet, but they will." Ottilie felt the cold move through her again. Her name in the newspapers, her father's shop on Teller's Lane, her father, who was probably still in the back room cataloguing deliveries with no idea that his daughter had walked into the center of the kingdom's most significant social event and stayed there. Her father. She stood up. "I need to go home," she said. Everyone looked at her. "My father," she said. "He does not know where I am. When the newspapers print this story, if my name is in it, he should not read it before I have spoken to him." She looked at Alaric. "I am not leaving. I am going to Teller's Lane, and I am telling my father what has happened today, which I should have done already." Alaric stood. "I will arrange transport." "I can walk," she said. "You will not walk," the dowager said, with the tone of someone closing a subject. "You will take the private carriage through the north gate. Cassius will arrange it." Cassius was already standing. "Give me 4 minutes." He left. The dowager stood, straightening her dress with small, precise movements, and looked at Alaric with an expression that carried the accumulated weight of a woman who had watched this particular man make careful, controlled decisions his entire life. "Go with her," the dowager said. Alaric looked at his aunt. "The Crown's meeting tomorrow. We'll be there tomorrow," the dowager said. "Go with her. Meet her father. Do not make the man read about his daughter in a newspaper." She picked up her gloves from the arm of the chair. "I will speak with the Crown's representative this evening. I have things to say to him that I have been holding for some time." She left without waiting for a response. The door clicked shut behind her, and the drawing room was suddenly very quiet. Ottilie looked at Alaric. He was looking at the door his aunt had just walked through, with the expression of a man recalibrating. "She is going to manage the Crown's representative," he said. "I gathered," Ottilie said. "She will do it better than I would have." "I also gathered that." He looked at her. Something in the air between them was different from the corridor, different from the cold sitting room, different from the hallway outside the meeting room. The palace around them had absorbed the shock of the afternoon and was settling into something new, some rearranged shape that was still taking form. They were standing inside that rearrangement, both of them, without a pillar or a ceremony or an argument about charter clauses between them. "I meant what I said," he said quietly. "All of it. Every word." "I know," she said. "I also know that knowing it and deciding what to do with it are different things. I am not asking you to decide everything today." He paused. "I am asking you to let me come with you to Teller's Lane and meet your father. That is all I am asking right now." She looked at this man who had stopped a royal ceremony, who had dismantled a legal trap with careful precision, who had stepped between her and a dangerous man in a hallway without hesitation, who had, for 3 years, come back every Thursday to a small bookshop because it was the one place in his life that felt like something real. "My father," she said carefully, "will ask you a great deal of questions." "Good," he said. "Now I have a great deal of answers." "He will also probably offer you tea that is not as good as this." "I prefer simpler tea," he said, and this time it was not almost a smile. It was one, small and real and entirely unguarded, and it was the most significant thing she had seen on his face all day. The carriage was waiting at the north gate when they reached it. Cassius had managed it in 3 minutes instead of 4, which Ottilie suspected was typical. Petra was there too, handing Alaric a folded note and speaking quickly into his ear about tomorrow's schedule. Two of the Devereux household guards fell in behind the carriage at a discreet distance, present but not intrusive. Ottilie climbed into the carriage and settled against the seat, and watched the palace gates close behind them through the rear window. And the city of Ashenvale moved past the carriage windows, the same streets, the same lamp-posts, the same garlands hanging from every post, the same paper crests with the Devereux seal. Everything that had been there this morning, when she had walked toward the palace with her shawl pulled tight and her heart hammering. All of it is the same. All of it is completely different. Alaric sat across from her, watching the city with the contained attention of a man who was accustomed to processing complicated situations quietly. He had removed the most formal elements of his ceremonial jacket in the interest of being slightly less conspicuous, but he was still, unmistakably, the Duke of Devereux, sitting in a carriage, heading to a bookshop on Tellers Lane. "She will have questions," Ottilie said. "Your aunt." "She always has questions," he said. "No, she also almost always already knows the answers." "Will she support this?" Ottilie asked. "When it becomes fully real, when the newspapers have the story, and the Crown has made its decisions, and Fenmore has made his next move, will she stand beside it?" He did not answer immediately. She appreciated that. A fast answer would have felt like comfort rather than truth. "Yes," he said, finally. "She will. Not because she is sentimental about it. Because she has watched me be dutiful and careful and entirely correct for my entire adult life, and she decided a long time ago that correct was not the same as good." He paused. "She told me once, 3 years ago, that I was building a life that looked exactly right from the outside and had nothing warm in it. I told her she was being dramatic." "Was she?" Ottilie asked. "No," he said. Now the carriage turned onto Tellers Lane, and the familiar narrowness of the street closed around them. The bookshop was the fourth building on the left, with its small painted sign and its window display of carefully arranged seasonal titles, and its door that always stuck slightly in cold weather. The light was on inside, which meant her father was still in the shop, which meant she had approximately 30 seconds before everything changed for him, too. She put her hand on the carriage door. "Ottilie," Alaric said. She looked at him. "Whatever your father says," he said, "whatever he asks, I want you to know that I am not here, because today was dramatic, and I acted without thinking. I am here because I have thought about very little else for 3 years, and today was the first moment I chose to stop being careful." He held her gaze. "I will not go back to being careful." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had been careful for so long that stopping must have felt like stepping off a ledge, who had done it anyway, in front of everyone, without asking her first, because he had known she would have stopped him. He had known her well enough to know exactly how to reach her. "Come inside," she said. "Meet my father." She opened the carriage door and stepped out onto Tellers Lane, and the familiar smell of the street hit her, stone and river, and the faint trace of printer's ink that always hung around the block. The shop door stuck slightly when she pushed it, as it always did. Bernard Vane Marsh was behind the counter with a pencil behind his ear and a delivery ledger open in front of him, exactly where she had known he would be. He looked up when the door opened, with the automatic expression of a shopkeeper greeting a customer, and then he saw Ottilia's face, and the expression changed. He was a quiet, perceptive man. Her father. He had raised her alone since she was 7, and he had learned, over those years, to read her face the way he read difficult texts, carefully, without rushing to conclusions. He looked at her. Then he looked past her, at the man who had followed her through the door. His pencil stopped moving. "Dad," Ottilie said, "there is something I need to tell you." Bernard Vane Marsh had a method for difficult conversations. He closed the ledger. He put down the pencil. He came around from behind the counter, and he pulled the door sign to close, not with agitation, but with the deliberate calm of a man who understood that some conversations required the world to be held outside for a while. Then he looked at his daughter, and the Duke of Devereux, standing in his bookshop between the shelf of travel narratives and the shelf of collected poetry, and he said, "I will put the kettle on." Ottilie had inherited her composure from him. She understood that now more clearly than ever. They sat in the back room, the three of them, among the delivery crates and the cataloguing shelves and the small stove that Bernard kept going through winter and sometimes through spring, because the back room never fully warmed. The tea he made was strong and slightly too hot and served in mismatched cups, and Alaric drank it without comment and with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. Or Ottilie told her father everything. Not the managed version, not the careful version. All of it, from the moment she had slipped in behind the seamstresses to the moment she had stood in the private corridor with Alaric, to the cold sitting room and the servants' passage, and the garden wall, and the drawing room with the Dowager Duchess. She told it straight through without softening the parts that made her look foolish, because her father had never once in her life made her feel foolish for telling the truth. Bernard listened the way he always listened. Completely, without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at his tea. Then he looked at Alaric. "You came to my shop every Thursday for 3 years, Bernard said. It was not a question. He said it the way a man says something he has quietly known for a long time and is only now giving a name to. Yes, Alaric said. You never introduced yourself by your proper title? No. Why not? Alaric was quiet for a moment. Because the moment I did, the nature of every conversation in this shop would change. And the conversations in this shop, he paused, were the only ones I had that felt honest. Bernard looked at his daughter. Something passed between them, the particular communication of two people who have lived closely enough together that words are sometimes unnecessary. Then he looked back at Alaric. My daughter is not a political arrangement, he said, quietly, without aggression, but with a solidity beneath it that did not bend. She is not a solution to a problem, and she is not a public gesture. Or if what happened today was about the ceremony and not about her specifically, I need you to tell me that honestly, and we will find a different way through this. It was about her specifically, Alaric said, with equal quiet and equal solidity. It has been about her specifically for a very long time. Bernard held the Duke's gaze for a measured moment. The stove ticked softly. Somewhere in the shop, a draught moved through the stacks, and the pages of the nearest shelf rustled faintly. She will not change who she is, Bernard said. Not for a title, not for a palace, not for any amount of social expectation. I am not asking her to, Alaric said. She will argue with you, Bernard said. About books and about everything else. She has very fixed opinions. I know, Alaric said. Oh, I find it clarifying. Bernard looked at his daughter again. She looked back at him and tried to tell him with her eyes what she had not yet said aloud, that this was real, that she was not swept up in the drama of the afternoon, that she had thought clearly in that cold sitting room and made a decision with her eyes open. He saw it. He always saw it. He picked up his tea and drank and set it down. There is a copy of Persuasion on the 3rd shelf, from the top on the right side of the main room, he said to Alaric. It came in last week. I have not catalogued it yet. I suspect you have not read that particular edition. Alaric looked at him. I have not. You should take it, Bernard said, when you leave. It was not a grand blessing. It was not a speech. It was Bernard Vane Marsh, in his own language, saying that the man across from him was allowed to come back. Ottilie pressed her lips together hard and looked at the stove. Alaric said, "Thank you." They stayed in the back room for another hour. Bernard asked Alaric practical questions, not hostile ones, about the timeline of the Crown's decisions, about the Fenmore situation, about what the newspapers would likely print and when. Alaric answered all of them directly, including the parts where the answers were not yet certain. He did not oversimplify or offer reassurance that was not grounded in something real. Her father, Ottilie noticed, was watching the way Alaric handled uncertainty, watching it closely and finding it acceptable. When Alaric finally stood to leave, Bernard walked him through the shop to the door with the quiet courtesy of a man in his own home. He took the copy of Persuasion from the third shelf and handed it over without ceremony. Alaric took it with both hands, which was the right way to receive a book from someone who had chosen it for you. At the door, Alaric turned back to Ottilie. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "The Crown's meeting will begin at 9. My aunt will have spoken with the first representative tonight. Cassius will have the revised partnership terms prepared. The situation will begin moving toward resolution." He paused. "I would like you to know the outcome before it appears in the newspapers." "How will I know?" she asked. "I will come and tell you," he said. Simply, like it was the most obvious thing. She nodded. He held her gaze for a moment, with that expression she had finally named. And sometime between the corridor and the carriage and the back room with the mismatched cups, it was not hope, exactly. It was something quieter and more settled than hope. It was the look of a man who had finally put something down that he had been carrying alone for too long and found that the ground beneath him was solid. He left. The carriage moved away down Teller's Lane, and the sound of it faded into the ordinary noise of the evening street. Bernard came to stand beside his daughter in the doorway. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. They stood there for a moment, looking at the street with its garlands and its paper crests, and its lamplight beginning to come on as the afternoon shifted toward evening. "The newspapers will be terrible," Bernard said. "Yes," she agreed. "People will say things." "Yes. You are sure," he said. Not a challenge, just a father making sure the ground beneath his daughter was as solid as she believed it to be. She thought about the pillar, about hiding behind it, gripping the cold stone, telling herself that one look would be enough to make her stop feeling what she felt. She thought about how wrong that had been, and how the wrongness of it had been completely visible to everyone except her. She thought about a man who had come back every Thursday. Not for the books. "I am sure," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders briefly, the way he had done since she was small, and then he went back inside to finish cataloguing the delivery. Ottilie stayed in the doorway a moment longer. She had walked into the palace this morning with a shawl and worn slippers, and a plan that extended no further than one look and a quiet retreat. She was standing on Teller's Lane now, at the end of an afternoon that had rearranged everything, not in the chaotic, frightening way she might have expected, but in the way that things rearrange when they finally settle into the shape they were always supposed to hold. She was not naive about what was coming. The newspapers would find her name by morning. Lord Fenmore would push through whatever mechanism he had available. The city would have opinions, loud and varied, and mostly uninvited. There would be rooms where people smiled with their mouths and calculated with their eyes, and she would have to learn which was which. But there would also be Petra, sharp and efficient, and entirely on the right side. There would be Cassius, who was wrong about wages and cheerful about admitting it. There would be the Dowager Duchess Renata, who had looked at Ottilie across a tea service and said she preferred what had actually arrived. And there would be Alaric, who had known her well enough to know she would run, who had known, somehow, exactly where she would end up. She went back inside and picked up the second delivery ledger from the counter, the one her father had not started yet, and she sat down on the stool behind the counter and she began to work. Because the shop did not stop needing to run, because the world had rearranged itself, because her father's cataloguing system had 17 subcategories that only the two of them understood, because normal things, continued alongside enormous things, were how a person kept their footing. She worked until the light outside had gone fully dark, and the lamp on the counter was the brightest thing on the street. Or then she heard it. Footsteps on Teller's Lane. Stopping outside the shop, the familiar small sound of the door sticking slightly, and then giving. She looked up. Alaric stood in the doorway with the copy of Persuasion under one arm, and an expression that was different from every expression she had seen on his face today. Quieter, more unguarded. The ceremonial jacket was gone entirely. He looked, for the first time since she had seen him in that hall, like the man from the Thursday afternoons, the one who turned pages with careful hands and sometimes read aloud without realizing. The Crown's representative agreed to the revised terms this evening, he said. My aunt was very persuasive. She would be, Ottilie said. The Fenmore matter will require further management, but the ceremony will not be reinstated. He paused. It is finished. She looked at him, standing in the doorway of her father's shop with a book under his arm and the lamplight catching the edge of his face, and she thought about 3 years of Thursdays and all the things that had been true between them that neither of them had said. You came back, she said. I told you, he said quietly. Some things are worth returning to. She had sold him that line once, years ago, in a conversation about a book he had already read twice. He had stored it. He had kept it. He had just given it back to her, in this doorway, at the end of this impossible day, as precisely and carefully as he did everything. She got up from the stool. She crossed the shop floor, past the travel narratives and the collected poetry, and the shelf of new arrivals that needed cataloguing, and she stopped in front of him, close enough that the lamplight reached them both equally. The door sticks, she said. You should come all the way in. He stepped inside. The door swung shut behind him with its familiar small resistance, and then the click of the latch, and then the quiet of the shop closed around them both. Outside on Teller's Lane, the garlands moved in the evening wind. The paper crests with the Devereux seal caught the lamplight as they turned, bright and small, spinning gently above a street that did not yet know it was part of a story that had just found its real beginning. Alaric set the book on the counter. Ottilie looked at it, then at him. Will you come back on Thursday? She asked. Yes, he said. And the Thursday after that. Everyone, he said, for as long as you will have me. She looked at this man who had chosen her, loudly and publicly and at enormous cost, in a room full of people whose opinion could reshape a life, who had then sat in a back room and drunk strong tea from a mismatched cup and answered her father's questions without flinching, who had come back tonight, on foot, with a book under his arm, because she had needed to know the outcome before the newspapers told it, who had always, in every way that counted, come back. Then you had better learn the cataloguing system, she said. It has 17 subcategories, and my father will test you on it. He looked at her with that small, real, entirely unguarded smile, the one she had first seen today, and already could not imagine his face without. Tell me the first category, he said. And she did. Outside, the city of Ashenvale settled into its evening, the unaware that in a small bookshop on Teller's Lane, the Duke of Devereux was learning how to shelve books, and a merchant's daughter was learning that some stories do not end the way you expect them to. They end the way they were always meant to, exactly where you are standing. Right now, After everything you just experienced in this story, here is something to think about. When Alaric raised his hand and said those 2 words in front of everyone, he was not just stopping a ceremony. He was choosing, out loud, the one thing he had been too careful to reach for. Has anyone in your life ever made a choice like that for you? Or have you ever made one like that for someone else? Drop your answer in the comments. We would love to read every single one. And if this story held your heart from the first moment to the last, now please hit the subscribe button. There are more stories like this one waiting for you, and we do not want you to miss a single one.